Since we have created the structure which represents the JSON data, so now let's create the function which would actually decode it, right? So we would make the function inside the structure content view actually, so as to use the values we get to be inside that body property. Elsewise it would create some problem. We have to create an instance of this very own data type of ours as well, so that we can use its value. You would understand it in more detail when we would be building the UI for this app. So for now you can just create an instance and declare it as a state private variable. And now we would start with creating our function. So this function's task is to use the API, the URL which we would provide, and load the data, decode it, and show it inside our app. Let's just name this load data, and there's just simple function syntax for now. We would be creating some constants here as well. First one would be URL, and now we are using guard just in case it throws an error if it is wrong or something, and we would deal it with two, like what we need to do here. So yeah, the URL is pretty straightforward. You just need to have the URL inside of it. So you can just copy it here, and yeah, there you go. You can just paste it in between inverted commas. Now it's okay. Now we would add other blocks for it as well, an else block, because you see that this is incomplete for now on its own. So we need to create an else block as well, which would have a print statement which states that if this is wrong, if this URL is wrong, we got the wrong thing, it should give out some error. So that's what we are actually doing here. The return statement just returns us back to the function. So if it is giving us a warning for now that the URL that we just created is not being used, so it's not does not make sense, but we would be dealing with it later on. So let's just create a new constant which would be named request, and it is of the type URL request, which takes in the same value, the URL that we created just now. I guess URL request is then sort of a structure only, since it has its own initializer. It could be a class as well. And now we are, you see, this thing is like quite complex, I know, but this specific function that we're just writing right now, just 2-3 values you need to change, and you could use it again and again for all of your decoding purposes. So that's what makes it so useful. So it's better to like try to learn the syntax for it. At least try to remember the main key points. And I myself have written it several times. That is why I know how to write this thing. It's not really required to like mug up things in programming, but for this very specific thing, it literally works for like tons of different APIs. So I would suggest you to try to write it down in some place and keep it with you in your notes app or something. So now what we are doing is that we just created this URL session.share.data task, and now inside of which we are writing some more code which would then further like facilitate our JSON decoding. And we just created like this decoded response constant, which then uses the JSON decoder and it decodes the response structure. The response structure is that which contains that top value that we created, that top which is actually of a type an array of results. If we just understood, result was the very first structure that we created, which has like 5 to 6 properties. And I'm just writing down some comments so as to make me remember when I come back to this code, like why I actually wrote this in the first place. So that is why comments are important, and I've told you this several times as well. So now we are using this dispatch queue dot async method. You see, when we actually use JSON decoder for decoding purposes, this runs in the background of the app. So what happens is that iOS requires the all the main functionality to run on the main thread, but since it is a decoding purpose, it's for decoding purpose, it actually runs on the background thread. So this function that we are just writing, this actually brings the whole thing back to the main thread. So that's how we can use it afterwards. Now we just declared like self.top is actually that decoded response.top. And in your case, suppose you are creating some other application and you named the array something different, then you would write that name here in place of top that I have written. And I only wrote top is because of the only reason that JSON data that we just saw on the web, right, it had contained that top value, so I had to do this. Otherwise I would have given it some other name, but in order to load it we need to do that. Now we are almost done with it, but in case something goes wrong that none of these things are related to, then it should also print an error, right? How would we know that our app is not functioning well? So for that reason we are just like creating another print function which would have written like fetch failed unknown error. So you can just easily like find where to look for changes, and I think in most of the cases it's the structures that we have made wrong, that is why we get that unknown error. So I'm just quickly writing it down, and we are almost done with this total function load data. There you go. Now we need to do like the one last step, which is like really important. We need to write resume. If you don't do this, then this whole thing is worthless, this whole function. So you just need to keep in mind that we need to write resume. So now we would move on to the next step in the next videos, where I would teach you how to use further create a UI and stuff.